My name's Adam Thomas and I'm an Associate Director at Luther Pendragon. We're a communications agency that works closely with BEAMA to help it influence government policy and thinking. And the last few months have seen some really dramatic changes in British politics as we've gone from a coalition government to a majority Conservative one. So I'm going to give you a short update on some of the key issues that's been taking place and how they... So we're 7 months into a new Conservative majority government, and certainly that came as a bit of a surprise to some people, particularly the pollsters. But what it's meant over the last 7 months is we're seeing a very different approach to government as to how we saw it over the last 5 years under the coalition. And we've seen some very different personalities come to the fore in some of the key departments that affect BEAMA and its members' work. Firstly, Department of Energy and Climate Change. There's a new Secretary of State, Amber Rudd, who was promoted as a junior minister, replacing a Liberal Democrat Secretary of State, Ed Davey. And we've got two new faces in terms of our new Energy Minister, Andrea Leadsom, and a new Minister in the Lords, Lord Bourne, who's looking at energy efficiency. And what's actually very interesting about these new people is that they're very closely politically aligned to the Treasury and George Osborne. And Amber Rudd was a former parliamentary aide to the Chancellor, and Andrea Leadsom was a Treasury Minister before going over to the Department of Energy. So we've got a department that's much more aligned than, say, arguably it was previously to the work of the Treasury. And that also goes the same for the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills, formerly led by Vince Cable under the coalition. We've now got Sajid Javid, who's a very different character and a very different politician to Vince Cable. So whereas Vince Cable was talking about much more public-private partnership, very relaxed about government intervention, we've now got a Secretary of State who's talking much more about removing the barriers on taxation, regulation from business, government stepping back from some of those things, but in return, industry's got to be much more forceful in coming forward and in giving government solutions and showing how policy can be industry-led. So we've got a very different approach. I'd also say that Sajid Javid is again another close political ally of the Chancellor. He's a former Treasury Minister and again very close to George Osborne. And over the last 6 months we've seen quite a flurry of decisions coming from the Department of Energy, some arguably quite controversial. So Amber Rudd has significantly reduced the subsidies for renewable energy. She has ended the Green Deal and is currently looking for a solution to that particular policy. And she's also announced that the government wants to see an end to coal-fired power stations by 2025. So some quite big decisions. And she clarified a lot of what she's trying to do in a major speech she gave on the 18th of November to the Institute of Civil Engineers, where she set out some of her long-term goals for the department. And the ending of the coal-fired power stations was a key element of that. But she also talked about how important energy efficiency was, and she also talked about how she wanted to see greater development of smart grids and smart technologies around energy policy. So it's clear that the government is changing quite a significant amount of policy, and that's why it's so important that BEAMA is at the forefront of working with the government to help it shape and influence those policies going forward. And BEAMA is really showing leadership at the moment in terms of taking a proactive role on the Bonfield review, which the government started in the summer. It's been working very closely with the Energy and Climate Select Committee as it looks to formulate and influence government thinking around energy efficiency in domestic properties. So we've now had the publication of the government's joint autumn statement and spending review document from the Treasury. And this is a really key document for the rest of the Parliament because it sets out the framework in which all the departments are going to operate over the next 5 years and will really dictate how new policies are formulated and, most importantly, how they're going to be funded. Now clearly there was a lot of speculation in the months running up to the spending review about how much the Chancellor was going to reduce spending. And I think a lot of people have been quite surprised at the fact that actually a lot of departments have got away with far less reductions than perhaps was initially expected. Now, the departments that BEAMA works with, DEC and BIS, were unprotected departments, so there was a lot of speculation that they may have to take quite significant cuts. In fact, the spending reductions they have had to work with actually are, relatively speaking, on the lower scale of things. So DEC has had to take a 22% reduction in its spending, BIS a 17% reduction in spending. And that's related to the fact that the spending review theme is all about putting Britain's security first. And clearly, energy plays a huge part in delivering that secure future, the secure economy that the Conservatives were talking about at the election in May. Now, what they've said, what DEC has said, is that its 22% reductions will come from things like tendering contracts better, pooling resources, greater efficiency in the department, and reducing headcount in the civil service. BEAMA is going to find its 17% mainly from its changes to its funding arrangements around the HE sector and moving funding away from HE into the science and into innovation funding pots. So let's have a look at what the spending review has in store for the Department for Energy and what it will mean for BEAMA and its members. Well, we know that the government's priority is to significantly reduce the bills of customers. So how's it going to do that? Well, it wants to reduce the bill by around £30 and it has around 3 core policies to try and achieve that. The first is the reform of the energy company obligation. And instead, when that ends in 2017, it wants to replace it with an energy efficiency supplier obligation. That'll run for 5 years and get a budget of 640 million per year plus inflation. And that will help to fund energy efficiency measures in people's homes. And the government estimates that will be around 200,000 properties, and it could reduce bills by as much as £300 in each of those individual properties over time. The second reform is a new £294 million fund to improve the energy efficiency in public buildings, so things like schools and hospitals. And they've also looked at the renewable heat incentive. Now, Amber Rudd was very clear that she wanted that policy to continue, so the Treasury has found new funding which will take the policy's funding up to £1.15 billion by 2021. Now, there has been some criticism of this policy by some commentators who have looked at the original figures that the Office for Budget Responsibility, who monitor Treasury spending, put out previously about how the policy was going to be funded. And on some estimates, the actual funding could mean that we see a cut of around £690 million to that fund. So we're going to really need to look at the detail to see how that policy is going to be delivered. The other key element to this is an increase in the innovation fund of the Department for Energy and Climate Change. And lots of departments have seen their innovation funds protected. But what the Department of Energy is seeing a doubling of that fund over the course of the Parliament, right up to £500 million. Now, the Chancellor has said that that's primarily going to be focused on new innovative nuclear technology. But the other element in the spending review that it sets out is it sets out that technology around smart grids should also be prioritised. So clearly there'll be an opportunity there for some BEAMA members to access that new level of funding. So what does this mean for BEAMA and its members? Well, the government is really placing a strong emphasis on innovation, but it's also saying to businesses, you've got to come forward with the solutions that we need to meet our priorities. It means, therefore, that organisations are really going to have to come forward with different innovative solutions to meet those challenges, but in an increasingly competitive funding environment. So it's clear from the spending review how much emphasis the government is placing on innovation. A lot of the spending is being moved to things like the Innovation Fund to encourage industry to come forward with innovative solutions to meet some of these big energy challenges that the country is facing. And that's important. What we were talking about earlier about what ministers want to see is industry leading this debate, but it's going to be done in a much more competitive funding environment. And that's why it's so important that BEAMA's got ahead of the game. Its members are, of course, leading in developing many of these innovative technologies. And the next steps now are going to be to have to show those technologies and promote those technologies to ministers and policymakers and advisors. And that's why it's so important that BEAMA has taken an early and leading role in things like the Bromfield Review, which is going to really help shape government energy efficiency policy going forward. So in Paris there's been climate change negotiations, which the UK is playing a full part in. The Prime Minister went to the start of the conference and gave a very impassioned speech about the UK supporting the objectives of capping CO2 increases to 2%. And certainly what Amber Rudd has been saying in Parliament and to the Select Committee is that the UK is very much determined and will play a full part in trying to reach an agreement. And of course we know that these conferences don't work unless all of the countries involved can reach that agreement. Now that has led to some discussion about how ambitious the targets are that they're trying to negotiate at the moment. The UK has bigger ambitions than perhaps than arguably the EU, and it was asked recently in Parliament whether the UK should be supporting those objectives coming out of the EU. And Amber Rudd has said, look, we've got to try and get a practical solution to this, we've got to get something that works, and importantly bring up the developing countries along with us. So what she said is that she's very much focused on that practical solution. Interestingly, she's also pointed out that it may not just be renewable technologies that gets us here, but actually low emissions and cutting emissions will contribute to those targets. And I think that's where some of those announcements that we saw on the 18th of November in a speech about cutting coal-fired power stations by 2025, the government very much sees that as a major contribution to reaching its overall international targets. So now that the EU's got to the Prime Minister's negotiating terms, what happens next? Well, EU leaders are meeting again on the 17th of December, and this is the target day that the government's got to try and reach an agreement on those 4 points that the Prime Minister has set out. Now, some are arguing that's slightly unlikely because of the situation in the Middle East, the terrorist situation, and dealing with the migrant crisis that we've got at the moment. If they can reach a deal in December, then we could be looking at a referendum as early as next summer. It won't be on the same day as the devolved nations elections or the London mayoral election on the 5th of May, but we could see a referendum in June or even July. Now, if they don't reach an agreement in December, there are no EU summits until well into 2016, which means that a referendum would have to be pushed either into the winter of the 2016, which is something the government doesn't really want to do, or into the beginning of 2017, remembering our backstop is the end of 2017. And the Chancellor's recently told a Select Committee meeting that he probably thinks that the beginning of 2017 is the most likely date. Well, we've talked a lot about the government, but what about the Labour opposition? Well, it's been a rather turbulent few months for Labour since the rather sensational election of Jeremy Corbyn. There's been controversy about his advisers. There was the John McDonnell stunt with Mao Zedong's little red book at the autumn statement debate. There's been massive disagreement within the parliamentary Labour Party about military strikes in Syria, and there's also been deep disagreements about the future of Trident under his leadership. That has all led to deep speculation about whether he's actually going to survive the full length of the Parliament, whether he'll even make it to next year. And this has sort of overshadowed, I think, a lot of what some of his other shadow teams have been up to. If you take the shadow energy team, for example, which is now led by Lisa Nandy, she's a newly elected MP. She was elected in 2010, so she's only been in Parliament for around 5 years. She's the MP for Wigan. She seemed to be predominantly on the left of the party, but a big policy thinker. And so far, we've not had a lot from the Labour opposition on energy policy. The line that we tend to get from Labour is that they are sticking to their election manifesto promises from 2015 until they're in a position to change those policies or amend those policies over the course of the next Parliament. But in her speech to the Labour Party conference, Lisa Nandy talked a lot about what she was calling democratising the energy sector, giving customers a greater say, and also localising some of the policies, so maintaining some of those policies we saw from Labour before the 2015 election on things like localising energy efficiency policy. But at the moment we haven't got a lot of detail about that, and perhaps unsurprisingly, only a few months into the new leadership team, what they've focused on is trying to pick holes in the government's policies, sort of criticising some of those key decisions that the government has made around reducing subsidies for renewable energy and policies like that. So the other main opposition party in Parliament is the Scottish Nationalists. And initially they welcomed Jeremy Corbyn to Parliament, but what they've since been doing is seeking to expose the differences within the Parliamentary Labour Party. Let's remember, Jeremy Corbyn was elected by the membership and the trade union membership of the Labour Party. He wasn't really wanted by the Parliamentary Labour Party, and the SNP know that. And the key thing they're looking towards is the Scottish parliamentary elections coming in May 2016, and they are very determined to cement their position as a natural party of government north of the border. So what they've been doing is really trying to harry the Labour Party, trying to expose those differences on things like Trident. So recently we've seen a debate in Parliament on the issue of Trident, seeking to divide Labour, but with the Scottish Nationalists showing a united opposition to key policies. And this is a key strategy that Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond and Angus Robertson, who's the parliamentary leader of the Scottish Nationalists, are trying to achieve. They are trying to show the Scottish Nationalists as a united opposition, opposing Conservative government, opposing what they call Conservative or austerity, and putting themselves against what they argue is a divided Labour Party. Now clearly over the next few months and years we're going to see Labour Party policy develop, and that's why BEAMA is very much focused on continuing to engage with the Labour Party. We're working closely with them to do that, to make sure that we're influencing that policy making process as it goes forward.